Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. In this episode, I am joined by Deana L. Weibel, who is a cultural anthropologist and professor in the Department of Anthropology with a joint appointment in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. Deana, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today about a topic that I find fascinating and one that we'll delve more into, which is your expertise and passion around religion, space, pilgrimage, and how all of those are sort of intersecting within the discipline of anthropology. So I'd love to hear more about who you are and what your background is and how you ended up being a space anthropologist.
Okay. Well, first of all, I grew up in Southern California, very close to Disneyland, like literally 4 miles from Disneyland. So I grew up with this huge place that pulled people in my entire life. And every time I would go, I would be fascinated by the range of people who would be there and the way that people from all over the world, this was in the 70s, would be present, 70s and 80s. And I got very interested in the idea that certain places had the power, spiritual magnetism, to cite Preston for a little bit, to draw people in and what caused that kind of attraction to them. So I ended up studying first French in college, then found linguistics, fell in love with linguistics. And then my junior year discovered that this thing called anthropology existed. And I would have minored in anthropology, but by that point, I was just taking courses to complete my credits. But I was in love enough with anthropology that I did end up going to graduate school at UC San Diego and did my doctorate in anthropology there. And UC San Diego's anthropology department, especially in the 90s, was very focused on religion. Almost everybody was doing research in terms of the faculty that connected somehow to religion, at least in the cultural folks. And there was also a very strong focus on psychological anthropology and cognitive anthropology. So that's kind of where I was trained. And I ended up working in Rocamadour, France, which is a shrine that's been around for over 1,000 years. It's a Black Madonna shrine. And I thought that I was going to be focusing on what the community around Rocamadour was like and how they dealt with this idea of living near a sacred space. But instead, what I found when I got there was that the site itself attracted Catholic pilgrims, but also a lot of atheist tourists, and agnostic tourists. And then this whole group that I hadn't been expecting, which were neo-pagan, Wiccan, what we used to call New Age or seeker type folks who understood the same place that was a Catholic shrine, but in terms of its pre-Christian identity or the idea of it being a site of energy. And I got very intrigued by how the same location could have distinct meanings for different people. So I did my PhD there. And when I moved to Michigan to take a job at Grand Valley State University, I very quickly met Glenn Swanson. Now, Glenn Swanson is a space historian. He founded a journal that's still in place called Quest, The History of Spaceflight Quarterly. But he literally started printing it on a printing press he bought in an auction in his garage in 1992. By the time I met him in 2003, it had been transferred over to University of North Dakota, and I think it's elsewhere now. It's still in print. It's like being published as a paper document, a quarterly. But he had gone on to work as NASA's chief historian at the NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston for several years. And so when we met, I was young anthropologist, very interested in space my whole life. Loved science fiction, was up early to watch space shuttles land and take off, and rode on Space Mountain at Disney a lot. And we obviously hit it off. We'll be married 20 years this year. But over time, he kind of slowly drew me into this, what I call the space community. And this is a diverse group of folks that include medical doctors who do space medicine or engineers, people who do computer work in space, astronomers, astronauts. And he set me up for my very first interview with an astronaut in 2004. And I had to get like retroactive IRB permission for that. But I did. And we co-wrote an article just ahead of our wedding in 2006. And that was called Malinowski in Orbit. And it was really focused on applying very basic early Malinowskian ideas about control and religious thinking and magical thinking to the space program. And I kind of had to put the space stuff on the back burner. At least I thought I did until I got tenure. But once I became, especially a full professor, I just went full steam ahead and focused on space stuff. So I did a sabbatical in 2019 where I went to a lot of different places, a lot of multi-sited ethnography. I was at the Johnson Space Center for some of that. I was at Kennedy Space Center, JPL. I went to the Mojave Air and Spaceport. And I spent a month living in the guest apartments of the Vatican Observatory in Castel Gandolfo, interviewing and following around astronomers who were members of the Jesuit order and who combine their religious views with their peer-reviewed astronomical research and participate in NASA missions and things like that. So since then, I've really been focused on that. I've got a book coming out in May 2026 this year called The Ultraview Effect, What We Can Learn from Astronauts About Awe, Humility, and Exploring the Unknown. And that's based on not just the work with astronauts, but also others in the space community, really exploring the idea of being in space as a physical location, understanding it as a physical location, and the kinds of things that happen to somebody spiritually, in many cases, from being in this weird place where there's no gravity or microgravity and you're literally floating and you're literally seeing the Earth from outside or looking out into space in ways that are not possible on Earth.
Thank you for starting with Disneyland. I actually remember when you were talking about Space Mountain, I remember going to Disneyland a few times as a child, and that was my favorite experience at Disneyland. So that kind of brought me back to that exact place when you were describing it, all the way through these threads around curiosity, the questions people ask, and what they're doing at sacred sites, to your own curiosity. I want to delve more into what you said about putting your interest in space on the back burner until you were tenured. I think that's a really important part of your story and the story of many academics. And so I want to delve a bit more into that. I'm super curious about the sabbatical in 2019. I have so many questions about the Vatican, and what that experience was like for you. Can you, I want to hear specifically about the kind of the essence around your PhD work in France and how it connects to your passion around space, and what you were learning from the pilgrims and tourists that you were interviewing, and probably what you were experiencing yourself as a researcher, and how that ends up in space.
Okay, let me think how to start. First about the back burner part of it. I think because I was hired as an anthropologist of religion and I did, pilgrimage has been something that's been studied in anthropology for decades. So that's kind of a subject that is its own subfield. It's small, but it's a very respected subfield. And I think the idea of doing space stuff really kind of seemed out there. Haha. Um, so I was doing it, but it was almost like seasoning on the pilgrimage stuff. But the more involved I was getting and the more opportunities I got to think about what it meant to go into space, the more I started to draw parallels. So one of the things that I took from my pilgrimage research, and I did work in Chimayo, New Mexico, as well as Rocamadour, France. And in 2016, it wasn't official research, but I got a chance to go to Nepal and visit a number of Buddhist pilgrimage sites as well. is the role of objects. And I was always very interested in the way that pilgrims of different stripes interacted with material culture in these sites. So the three things that were really evident to me were people would bring things to shrines. So the idea of an ex voto, right, where you will leave something to prove that you've been there. And in Chimayo, especially, that's got dirt that's believed to have healing powers. People will leave photographs, they'll leave crutches, they'll leave um, milagros, which are these little metal, like aluminum or tin body parts that if you are having a heart problem, for instance, you might leave a milagro of a heart there. And that idea of leaving something of yourself to prove that you were there, to encourage other people to pray for you. So like you're representing yourself by an object. And then there are also objects that people bring home.
Mhm.
And so you have at Chimayo, people will bring dirt home. At Lourdes, people will bring water home. Rocamadour, there are copies of the Black Madonna that people will buy, or there was a sportel that very early pilgrims to Rocamadour would get printed out to prove that they'd been there, and they sell replicas of those as well. So that idea of I've been there and I've come back with something. So like when I was visiting the Vatican Observatory, which is outside of Rome, I did do an audience with Pope Francis, and I brought 30 rosaries with me that I was stopped at security. They were curious what I had in my bag, and it was like 10, you know, things of 10 rosaries that I brought back. So that idea of bringing things with me back from a shrine, it's a common thing. But then the other one, and getting back to the rosaries as well as other things that I've noticed in my own research, especially with folks in more of the neo-pagan or Wiccan persuasion, is taking an object that holds meaning to you, but bringing it with you to a certain location so that it can be charged with the energy of a particular site. And so bringing that back home again. And I saw that a lot with neo-pagan folks at Rocamadour. One example was in a Catholic shop in Rocamadour where a woman wanted to buy a statue of the Black Madonna that had been on the shelf. And the storekeeper, who I was friends with, said, no, I mean, that's just the display. I'll go back and get you another one. And she was holding it. She said, no, I have to have this one. I've filled it with energy. And so that idea that the site itself imbues objects with things. Those rosaries that I brought to the audience with the Pope, they were blessed. He would do this thing near the end of his homily where he would bless whatever people had brought in the crowd to have blessed. And so I came home with 30 blessed rosaries, and those turned out to be, fantastic for distribution and things like that, to people I knew at work or people I knew in other settings, especially Catholic folks. And what I was noticing with space, to get back to space, is that there was this parallel with these objects. So people have left lots of objects on the moon. The Apollo astronauts left, some of it is not so nice, right? So bags of waste, lunar rover, because you can't get rid of it, but some of it was very symbolic. So Charlie Duke from Apollo 16 left a photograph of his family on the moon, which is like what I saw at Chimayo, people leaving photos, remembrances. There is a little statue called the Fallen Astronaut on the moon that is meant to represent all of the astronauts who died in accidents related to space and kind of bring them to the moon. People will bring things back. So it's hard to bring things back from space except for the moon, and moon rocks are there. But the way that moon rocks were treated almost as symbolic currency or symbolic gifts from astronauts to different nations. And so every nation received moon rocks. The Vatican Observatory has moon rocks that they study. They have one on display. And that idea of having things from space that are connected to that place is very similar to water from Lourdes or water from the Ganges or Zamzam water from Mecca. And you've also got this notion of bringing things with you. And this is where I got very interested in this, because I saw people filling objects with energy. People will bring objects into space intentionally, astronauts in particular, in their personal preference kits, which are pretty small. and they will have them be in space in order to bring them back. And so one of the Catholic astronauts I interviewed had 4 different crucifixes for each of the missions they went on. And those are each associated with those missions and being in space. I heard a story of, this was from, I think, an engineer who knew of some astronaut who had been given a piece of jewelry from his wife to take into space and bring it back again. But instead, he brought back a spoon or something and left her necklace up there, thinking, well, she wanted something from space, right?
Yeah, he missed the point.
Right. One of my non-religious astronauts that I interviewed actually took dirt from one of his sports team's fields. I'm being vague on purpose, with him into space and then brought that back to them, but kept some of it secretly for himself. So the idea of it came from their field. So it was already sacred ground, right? It's almost like double sacralized kind. And so that idea of objects and material culture, I realized that space is being treated like a pilgrimage destination in ways, and that the overlaps were like really locked in, really complete, except the idea was less overtly spiritual and a little bit more otherworldly. Otherworldly works.
Yes. And the view of the objects is sort of this, going back to your original point about how you found this connection. There are these rituals with the objects that are very parallel between what you've just described in space or on the moon and other pilgrimage sites. When you and the space community think about space, to me as a someone who is uninformed about space travel, and it just all feels big and out there. Is space considered a place? I can see where the moon would be identified. That is a very concrete place, but are there other places in space, or is it sort of anything beyond our gravitational pull is the place?
That's an interesting question, and I'm still exploring that. Another, you had asked me about anthropologists who do work with space. Lisa Masseri did a great book called Placing Outer Space, where she talks about how engineers and people who send probes into space have, instead of thinking of what's in space as objects, have started thinking of them as places,
Mhm.
how that works. I think it's a place with a lot of places in it, would be the best way I can describe it. People do talk about outer space as a specific location. But then obviously each planet, each moon, each asteroid has its own characteristics. So I do think that you could argue that it's a void rather than a place, but
Mhm.
it got place-like characteristics. And then the spacecraft that people inhabit. I'm really interested in the idea of space stations as residences where people have a culture that they go into. One of the astronauts I interviewed talked about how you shift over crew from one crew to another. And some of it's technical, but some of it's like, where do you put the dirty towels? So he said it was like visiting somebody's guest house. And so getting to know the spacecraft as places, right? Which I'm sure have parallels with submarines and houseboats and
Mhm.
kinds of vehicles that people live in. But also, when people do an extravehicular activity, especially like a spacewalk where they're just attached to the space station from outside, that idea that you're surrounded by whatever space is, I think it does have place-like qualities there. Certainly the moon has place-like qualities and any body that you can walk on, but I think we're still exploring what those things mean.
When astronauts are in space stations, do they consider them a home away from home, or is it, I mean, we talk about work-life balance on Earth, and that's a whole sort of interesting dialogue, particularly during and post-pandemic, about these blurred lines. How do astronauts view these places that they're living and working in, that they can't escape, really?
Right. Um, Often there's a parallel drawn with McMurdo Station in Antarctica with the idea of being in this sort of desolate outpost. It's different though, because McMurdo, you can, get away if you need to, and there's, plenty of oxygen. You don't want to be outside too long, but you can breathe. Um, with a space station, you've got this view of the Earth. So it's not like you're desolate, but you're not desolate. You're there, but you're not there. You're away from Earth, but at the same time, it fills the entire cupola window. But what I find is that people who I've talked to about it tend to love it. They enjoy being up there. They are very busy. And that's one of the things that kind of counters the ability to have certain spiritual experiences in space is they call it chasing the red line. They've got like a list of things that they have to accomplish each day, and you're trying to get them all done on a particular schedule. And so everybody is very involved, very, very busy doing what they need to do. And sometimes it means that it's kind of like a workaholic's paradise. Um,
It's the ultimate escape from whatever on Earth.
right, exactly. I mean, people have internet now. So, right,
Yeah.
they email and they do video calls. I saw um, an event actually at the Ark Encounter in Kentucky called the Astronaut Encounter this past summer. And Butch Wilmore, who was one of the two astronauts along with Sunita Williams, who was stuck in space, he talked about how he would go onto Zoom and go to church every week from the space station. So there's still some ability to do kind of a quarantine like social activity, and people do interact with family members, so they're not that isolated. But at the same time, leisure time is at a premium. People will bring books to read. They'll do different things. They'll watch movies. There's actually a dedicated little theater area where people will watch movies together. Um, but I had one female astronaut that I interviewed who talked about how she would have tried to enjoy looking into space more, but she felt so much pressure because she was one of the earlier female astronauts that she felt that if she screwed anything up, it would taint the idea that women should be in space. So rather than relaxing and enjoying her downtime, she was very focused on being the best, doing things the way she should do them so that a woman in her position wouldn't be questioned. And she kind of regretted that. Other people I know, another astronaut I know took up painting in space. Certainly famous astronauts like Chris Hadfield will play, musical instruments or even write music while in space. There's religious ritual and activity that takes place, meditation, communion services, including Catholic communion services that are probably not strictly the way that people would expect them to be done. And it's really a place where humans live and interact with other humans and have what amounts to a normal life, except people come in and out, and you get new crews arriving and old crews leaving. And some of just the weirdness of it is physical, medical. Um, There are lots of people who have something called SANS, which I can never remember. It's something neuroocular syndrome. It's all the fluid in your body. Your heart on Earth beats in such a way to push your fluids against gravity. So keep them up in your upper body, because otherwise they're going to pool in your legs. You get into space and your heart continues doing that, except there's no gravity pulling your blood down. So all your blood is pumped by your heart into your upper body, into your head. Everybody's got a cold in space. They lose their sense of smell. They also have a lot of fluid buildup, intraocular pressures. And then also you're exposed to micro radiation, bits of micro things that go through. Like apparently you can close your eyes and see bright lights shooting through that are really literally going through your head.
Wow.
One of the astronauts I interviewed said that he had to have very early cataract surgery because the radiation had melted his lenses, and he wasn't the only one.
Wow.
So that kind of physical situation, and then just the getting used to microgravity and floating, people get sick, obviously, from it until they get used to it. A lot of astronauts start out on anti-nausea medication. But one of the astronauts I interviewed talked about when he got home, it was so strange back on Earth because he would go to lie down and he said the pillow would just like slam into his face. He wasn't used to this idea that he was going to fall into things. Or he would look at the ceiling and feel like he should be able to just push himself off and go over there. So the shift in people's perceptions, there's a lot for embodiment research.
Yes, it sounds like it.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that astronauts are describing their experiences with awe or spiritual experiences? It sounds like those astronauts who are Catholic continue their religious practice in a different setting.
To
Uh,
some extent.
to some extent. And I'd really like to hear more about that, as well as what you're hearing from astronauts about uh, spirituality, awe. Certainly, I can imagine there's a different engagement with God, or the concept of God, an actual God. What is that like for astronauts?
It's really interesting because different people, it's kind of like Rocamadour. You asked me how I did that.
Yes.
A lot of my Rocamadour stuff was focused on this giant cliff and how it made people feel small and the idea of the sublime and awe again,
Mhm.
base of this cliff. And I think that has influenced sort of my approach to some of the space stuff, seeing parallels there. First of all, the first astronaut I talked to who had spiritual experiences in space, it was what Frank White coined the overview effect, looking at the Earth from outside. And this particular person was an evangelical astronaut, evangelical Christian, who had kind of a quasi literal understanding of the Bible, but also believed the universe was 14 billion years old, and that even though humans were made in the image of God and were the same as they'd always been, animals would change over time to different environmental conditions. So, kind of like this blending of things. But he was an engineer, and he said seeing the Earth from space, he understood it as seeing the Earth from God's perspective and understanding God's work as an engineer, seeing it from the outside, seeing how the pieces work together, and understanding it as an object that had been created and engineered in a way that you can't see when you're here. And he stayed in touch with a Sunday school that he was teaching, stayed in touch with that class. This was back in the 70s and 80s, so there wasn't the internet or anything like that. It was a little bit more distant. But he continued his spiritual understanding in space. Then when I interviewed other astronauts, one that was really striking is somebody I call Zach in my research. And I have to be careful because we're supposed to use pseudonyms
Mhm.
and that, and I do, but it's such a small population, especially when I say things like he was in orbit around the moon. And it's like, okay, that limits it to a bunch of people.
Mhm.
But Zach was in orbit around the moon, happened to be by himself at that moment. He was on the far side of the moon while the other astronauts on his team were on the moon. And he decided to turn all the lights off in the capsule. And he said he was in the shadow of the moon and the shadow of the Earth, kind of at the same time, like really in shadow. And the sun was completely blocked. He turned off all the lights and got his eyes adjusted to the dark. And then he looked out the window and I interviewed him 4 times and we talked about this multiple times, but, he said the stars were like nothing he was prepared for, that there were so many he couldn't see between them. And it was this overwhelming feeling of just how big the universe was. And I've talked to astronomers, I've talked to planetarian people who are trying to figure out like where he would have been looking. And I have another astronaut who describes something very, very similar from Earth orbit, which is interesting. And I've had some people tell me, well, that's not what they would see. I'm just, once again, if somebody tells me that the Virgin Mary was present at Rocamadour, I'm not like interrogating the truth of that claim.
Yes.
So in this case, I'm assuming that they're not that they're describing to me what they themselves understand. So many stars he couldn't see between them. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Drake equation. I can't give you the actual equation,
No.
but the gist of it is if you understand how many stars there are out in the universe and that we can see, and we imagine each one of those as a sun that has potentially planets. And if you think of the potential for life on those planets as minuscule, there are still so many out there that even if only 0.000001% have any kind of life, it's still an endlessly large number with life. And so the numbers that he apparently saw with his own eyes was something that changed him. And he came back and, pilgrimage is often said to be transformative. This was a transformative experience. And I don't think it was tourism either. I think there's something very deeply spiritual that happened. I had published an article and Zach sought me out to talk to me about this. So it was kind of amazing to get an email from an astronaut.
Yeah, that would be pretty incredible saying, "I wanna talk to you about this one particular experience that I had."
Exactly. But another that I call Theo in my work, he's the big spiritual seeker, and I've interviewed him 3 or 4 times. And he's gone out. He took Catholic communion, although he's not a Catholic, with somebody who brought communion wafers with them, consecrated communion wafers into space. Um, he wanted to see space while dark adapted from the space shuttle and went several times where he couldn't do it because nobody was willing to turn all the lights off during a night pass while they were on the dark side of the earth. And because they wouldn't do that, he said it was like trying to go look at the stars from a room with all the lights on. Like you can't see anything. So he finally was able to work with a commander who he was on good terms with. And this person did agree that would turn the lights off and get dark adapted during this time period. And he talked about seeing the stars in a way that was very similar to Zach. He said it was a solid white wall. And he said, it's the most spiritual thing you can do. You're seeing galaxies with the naked eye. And he would seek out those spiritual experiences. Another thing he did was meditation, where he described it to me. He pushed off from the wall in the shuttle what he called a perfect drop. So he was no longer floating around. He managed to get still. And he talked about closing his eyes and letting there's a specific posture when you're in space that if you let your muscles relax, it's not like this, it's more like this with your legs bent, almost like a fetal position in a way. And he went into this deep meditation where he stopped feeling his limbs. He stopped having a sense of a body. He didn't know where he was, just he was in the universe. And he described it as this is very intense meditation that sounds to me a lot like being in a sensory deprivation
It
tank.
sounds very womb-like.
Yeah, but this person in particular is the one person I know who didn't have a strong connection to a particular religious tradition and who went up and was kind of trying things from different traditions. So he did take Catholic communion despite not being Catholic. He described this meditation as Buddhist despite not being Buddhist. So very similar to some of the folks I would see at Brocamador.
Mhm.
But also in this, Diane Pasulka, who writes about UFOs, got irritated with me for being like this. But sometimes I'll be like, but these are really super educated, intelligent people. So woo sometimes is a little pejorative. This person, I can't say too much, but has multiple advanced degrees, in a range of subjects. So this is somebody who is a serious scholar, I would say, but who still wanted to have these experiences of spirituality in space. And I will say they seek out different spiritual experiences on Earth as well. Um, and so for some folks, it's that level, like he's the most Theo, that's why I called him Theo,
Yeah.
the most of an experience seeker, and others will have experiences that might be spiritual or that might be tied very directly to their own religious tradition, but interpreting what they're experiencing through the lens of that tradition.
And in Theo's case, it would seem like chasing a high all the time after having that experience and being a seeker and then kind of stumbling literally into this experience. It must be very difficult to top that.
He argued that he had experiences that were similar enough on Earth that he continued to seek. But space was the one place where, I'll quote it again, you could see galaxies with the naked eye. He also argued that NASA should let people be on top of their spirituality in space. He says the actual quote was, it's like goddamn food or water. Um,
Well, so what would that look like? What is your understanding if NASA was let people be on top of their spirituality, what would that structurally look like?
it's interesting because we have sort of a counter example, that's with the Russians right now. So, Alice Gorman, Justin Walsh, and Mary Solomon have done some work as archaeologists on the International Space Station. And they wrote an article for a special issue of Religions I co-edited that was focused on icons in the Russian module part of the International Space Station. And so it used to be when the ISS was first built, the International Space Station, there was a picture of Yuri Gagarin and a few other important cosmonauts, but it became, after the fall of communism, much more overtly a place to put pictures of Russian Orthodox patriarchs and saints and Madonna and Child. And there's this whole wall that's just specifically religious items. And I've been previewing this upcoming book by Yenia Gorbanenko, and she talks a lot about the religious nature of cosmonauts and the way that many cosmonauts, but not all, are quite religious. And there's this movement of religious icons into space, and then they're brought back down again and distributed to Russian Orthodox temples throughout Russia. And their space flownness is sometimes important to some people and less important to other people. But once again, we see objects imbued with meaning. um, I think in the US, because of the separation of church and state and something very similar with the European Space Agency, there's less of a national religious feeling. Some people would argue that's still there. So I mentioned Butch Wilmore previously going to church services via Zoom from space. And I'm talking using his real name because this was a public talk I attended, so it wasn't an interview or anything I did. Um, he has been very open about prayer before launches and has a very strong connection between sort of American patriotism and a certain sort of Protestant Christianity. He also, this Ark Encounter thing I went to over the summer, and this, I didn't know about it, but another astronaut I interviewed brought it to my attention. It's like, you should go to this. And I was like, okay, but it's Butch Wilmore along with Jeffrey N. Williams and Charlie Duke, all identified as young Earth creationists. So astronauts who say on the record that they believe the universe is 6,000 years old and believe in a very literal understanding of the Bible. And Ken Ham, who's kind of famous for debating Bill Nye, he was there. And it was this whole day where each of Ken Ham and each of the three astronauts gave an hour-long talk apiece and then did a Q&A, all in sort of the shadow of this replica of Noah's Ark. And it was a very interesting experience with a very large crowd of young Earth creationists mostly gathered. And the argument being that Bill Nye said that young Earth creationists couldn't be scientists. So he was arguing that, yes, we can. Look at these astronauts. That being said, astronauts traditionally aren't scientists, but are like jet pilots and military and test pilots. Some since the 70s have been have been PhDs, but it really is a mix. You're not automatically a scientist just because you're an astronaut. I kind of
Yeah,
went on.
that's an interesting differentiation. I appreciate you saying that because I think as someone who doesn't have a strong understanding of space travel, period, would have thought that all astronauts would be considered scientists. So that's important.
And I think there's that reputation, but Theo, I would count as a scientist.
Mhm.
Zach, I would not count as a scientist. In fact, Zach told me it was important to bring scientists because it's a lot easier to teach a scientist to be a pilot than it is to teach a pilot to be a scientist.
Yeah, I can see that. When you were talking about the icons and the Russians bringing these images, there's a strong tradition of lighting candles in front of the
Amen.
images, and so it made me wonder, has something replaced that ritual?
That's actually a really good question, and it's not something I've seen addressed. You definitely should not be lighting candles because the microgravity makes things act very, very weird, and you can have fires. In fact, the Mir space station did catch on fire. They were able to put it out, but they were this was a Russian space station in the 1980s, where it's roughly the size of a school bus, and part of it was on fire. So, like, it was a very bad situation. Um, but with birthdays, they have something that's sort of like, I can't even tell you what it's made of, but I've seen pictures of it. That's kind of a fake candle that goes into like a
Yeah.
little cake.
Like a flameless candle.
Yeah, or it just kind of something that's red, like there's a lot of improvisation when it comes to food and when it comes to sort of non-religious rituals, like, we're going to celebrate a holiday. Costumes are big. I've seen a lot of videos for like Halloween where people are floating around dressed like, zombies or Martians or
Yeah.
whatever in space. Um, almost every crew that's been in space on Halloween has some Halloween picture.
That's
Um,
funny. I mean, children, for Halloween are dressing up as astronauts, and the astronauts themselves are having an experience where they're dressing up as Martians. That's funny.
right. And there's a lot of, different things like you can do, like playing with your food and things like that. Throwing stuff around. The I'm I think there have to be alternative ways to perform certain rituals, but it's kind of like anything else. Like one of the best examples of this was, and I can never remember his full name. He was a Malaysian cosmonaut, something Sheikh Mustafar. He was from Malaysia and he went up into space during Ramadan. And so the question was, what do you do if you're a practicing Muslim and you're in space during Ramadan, where you're supposed to fast from sunset to sunrise, reverse that, sunrise to sunset, but you're orbiting the Earth. So sunrise to sunset is 45 minutes. I mean, we all fast for 45 minutes, right? So Malaysia, their organization, religious organization, had kind of a get together and they issued a set of guidelines, and the guidelines were like you can put off Ramadan until you're back and you can do your fast later. But other things like ablutions before you pray, where you're supposed to wash your hands up to your elbows and your feet up to your knees, there's not that much liquid water available. So what do you do? Or how do you pray toward Mecca when you're in space, when you're literally orbiting the Earth? And so they put this whole list of guidelines together. I've got a copy of it somewhere translated, where a lot of it comes from traditional Arabic ideas about being in the desert where you might not have water. So, for instance, you can wash your hands by touching them against a clean surface. Or if you, in some of them, they had to get creative. So if you are orbiting, you want to pray toward Mecca to the best of your ability. But if you're like on the moon, you're just going to pray toward Earth. If you're outside of the solar system, you're going to pray toward the sun. So the idea of doing it as closely as possible. Also, the prayer positions in Islam, when you're praying in the direction of Mecca, you would kneel. You at some points you put your forehead on the ground to indicate submission. Islam, and how do you do that when you're in microgravity? And this Malaysian cosmonaut showed how he hooked his feet under they always are hooking their feet under things to stay in place. And he had to do everything standing and leaning forward at the waist, but he couldn't get on his hands and knees, obviously. But some of that also has precedent where if somebody is unable to move, if they're elderly or if they have, an injury or are physically impaired in some way, you can just move from the waist up. Or if that's not possible, you just move your head and your eyes. And if that's not possible, you just imagine the movements. And so there's precedent that can be carried over into practicing rituals in microgravity. That's really interesting.
Is that these types of commentaries or publications that you've described in the Islamic tradition, is this the type of structural focus that you referenced and that I think it was Theo referenced, where religion should be front and center like food and water in
I
space?
think so. I mean, I'm not making that argument. That was Theo's argument, but his argument was that it improves efficiency.
Okay. Yeah.
If you have a spiritual outlet, if you're allowed to do spiritual things, if you're allowed to feed your soul, essentially.
Hmm.
His argument was like, if you're going to feed your body, you should also feed your soul. That being said, I've interviewed astronauts who were very atheistic, who described the entire experience as essentially non-spiritual. One astronaut in particular didn't even have the overview effect. This has been picked up by a couple journalists who love it because it's like a counter to that
Hmm.
idea. But he said, yeah, I was getting ready to look at the Earth from the cupola. I was prepped for it. He said, I even meditated a little bit ahead of time. And I looked out and it was okay. It was fine. Some astronauts were like, "Oh yeah, you realize the borders are artificial or the atmosphere is really thin." He said, "But I already knew that." So he was kind of unimpressed by everything. Another astronaut was like, "Yeah, I guess that's fine." But when I looked out at the Earth, I realized that it was fragile and we're going to destroy ourselves in 500 to 1,000 years. And so enjoy life while you can. I was really mostly impressed by the machine I was in, and I really liked the machine. And
It's
so,
yeah, it's fascinating to me. I'm always really intrigued by people who have experiences that there's sort of this expectation of awe, and they don't experience that, and it sort of sets into motion, a number of psychological, responses to include kind of going dormant, and not wanting to talk about the experience because it doesn't align with this larger group, experience at a site, and so I can imagine there would be a lot of pressure on astronauts because there are so few of them. And there is an expectation by those of us on the ground to want to hear something magnificent and
right.
inspiring and awe inducing. And it must be very difficult for people who don't have that experience.
Um, the one astronaut I have to be very careful with. I will try not to identify which one I'm talking about. But one of the astronauts I've mentioned, whose name I didn't mention, whose pseudonym I didn't mention, to be more explicit, will frequently speak to a religious organization that he's part of, but is secretly an atheist. And part of what he talks about is, what it meant to be an astronaut. But he really was like, I need confidentiality. I'm like, no, I'm
Mhm.
not going to dox who you are at all. Um, so that pressure to have a certain experience is there. It's interesting because there was a made for TV movie in the 70s that I've watched on 16 millimeter because my space historian husband has a copy. I think it was called Down to Earth, and it was about Buzz Aldrin when he returned from the moon, having essentially a mental breakdown because not because he'd been in space, but because of the expectations and the knowledge that he sort of had peaked. And this idea that he wasn't the first person to walk on the moon, he was the second. Apparently, that was like an issue for him. So that's there. I've also noticed, I mentioned that one astronaut who speaks to a religious group who's not a true believer. I have seen a pattern in a lot of my astronauts who are very religious that they will speak to their religious groups from the perspective of someone who has special spiritual knowledge because they've been in space. And so there are biblical quotes that talk about, like, Job somewhere says that the earth is suspended in nothing. I'm really bad at coming up with chapter and verse off the top of my head. Or in certain psalms talking about the heavens declare the glory of God. Um, Other ones, God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. And one of astronauts I've talked to have talked about seeing the earth suspended in nothing, which they understand, some of them, as confirming Job, confirming the circle of the earth as something that they've seen. Um, and so they will come back and talk to religious groups about the experience of being outside of the earth from a godlike perspective and confirming things that must be true, because if somebody in biblical times wrote about that and then they've confirmed it in the 20th century or 21st century, that it's evidence of proof of scripture. And so there's this interesting rhetorical strength in having been into space. And when Ken Ham was talking to Charlie Duke, who's been to the moon, he argued that if people in the audience had friends and family who didn't believe in the moon landings, this was evidence against that, because Charlie Duke is a God-fearing man, and would he come here and lie to us? And so the proof was in the religiosity of the astronaut rather than in any number of scientific ways you could
Mhm.
prove that humans have been to the
Yeah.
moon.
I've been really into the concept lately, over the past couple of years, of affordances, which has its origin in conservation psychology. this idea that certain places, certain elements in a place afford meaning in a particular way, and there's like a subcategory of affordances called canonical affordances, and it sounds like that's exactly what's happening for these communities with the astronaut. The experience is sort of validating this canon, the religious canon, and also the traditions that are affiliated with particular religious communities. And so there's a very symbiotic process that's developing between the community and the astronaut as an authority figure in an sort of extra religious way, or sort of a pseudo religious way, or maybe even a particularly religious way with the communities that is different than other leaders in their communities.
Yeah, I think that's true. And sometimes there is pressure on them to say certain things. One of them that I spoke to said that he went to talk to a church group and the minister was kind of pressuring him to say there was no life elsewhere in the universe. And he's like, well, I can't agree to that. I don't know. So that idea that you are there to verify things from that particular perspective. And many astronauts have had religious experiences in space. Some who I didn't interview because they passed away before I was doing this research for sure. But like Jim Irwin is a really good example. He came up with something called, I believe, Higher Calling and started a ministry after returning from his Apollo 15 moon walk. And he spent a lot of money trying to find Noah's Ark, mountains, near Mount Ararat, looking for that. But he talked about putting something together on the surface of the moon and not being sure how to do it. And he could have, this is in his memoir, he could have called NASA and gotten information, or instead he shot up a prayer and God told him what to do. And so he did it and it was successful. So this feeling of being in contact with God while in space. The one I interviewed, who's self-described evangelical, also talked about having God continuously present with him in space. Um, but outside of Christianity, there was an astronaut named Edgar Mitchell. And Edgar Mitchell, I think Apollo 14, he had what he called, now I'm blanking on the term, I think it's from Hinduism, sadhvi. And it was this experience of knowing how connected he was to the entirety of the universe. So he'd gone to the moon, he was on his way back, and he just had this feeling on the flight back to Earth that he was being given all of this information about sort of the unity of everything in space and his own body and everything that was out there. And it was all interconnected. And when he came back, and you mentioned woo, this is, he started something called, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, with the idea of noesis being a form of knowledge that just sort of comes to you. And he would talk to people in, you know, Hindu or Buddhist traditions about that being something that happens to certain um, people who've dedicated themselves to like religious meditation and scripture, where they have this inpouring of knowledge. And he took that very, very seriously. I was talking to one of my Christian astronauts about that. And I was like, well, Edgar Mitchell had this experience. And he said, well, he said he did. So,
Yeah. Is so on Earth, I mean, in many religious traditions, we perceive God as being out there in the heavens. There are different terms for it, but somewhere beyond Earth. For astronauts, is God perceived there's probably many answers, but is God perceived there in space, or is God perceived even beyond the place wherever that place is that they are?
yeah, I mean, once again, there's variation in beliefs. I have not interviewed a Mormon astronaut, but from a Mormon perspective, God is on a planet in the solar system. So God would be, I mean, not our solar system, sorry.
Hmm.
God is on a planet elsewhere in
Yes.
the universe, not like one of ours. But um, that would be maybe more of a literal interpretation of God being out in space. But for most people, there's this moving target. And so people used to think that God was in the heavens. In fact, in my book, I recount something I read in Joseph Korn's book, The Winged Gospel, where apparently Charles Lindbergh kept a diary, and he was kind of a barnstormer for a while before he did his transatlantic flight. And he had a woman approach him and ask him, or she wanted to pay him money to take her to heaven because she was tired of living on this life, and she thought that he could physically fly her to heaven. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yes.
Um, Shannon Lucid, who I haven't interviewed, but her parents were missionaries, and she was born in a prison camp during World War II in China because her parents had been arrested for being Christian missionaries during that time period. And I've looked into her experience going to, I think it was also the Mir space station in the 80s. And she was from a very evangelical tradition, and her pastor working with a Russian Christian, got tapes to evangelize specifically to the cosmonauts in the space station that she brought up with her to play for them. But one of her ministers that wished her was like, "Oh, now you've done better than your dad. You've gotten closer to God." And there's a quote in a nnewspaper where he says that she's like outdone her preacher dad because now she's in space and
Yeah.
closer to God. And he also tells her to open a window and experience it. I know he doesn't mean open a window, right? Because she'd be sucked out into space, but that idea of proximity. That being said, I mentioned Yenia Gorbanenko's book, and she talks about how in Russian Orthodox Christianity, there's the idea of different skies. And so the first sky is the sky we see from Earth, and the second sky is space, but the third sky is heaven. And that the cosmonauts who are religious are interested not in being in the second sky as much as they are being in the third sky.
That's so fascinating.
I know. I'm really enjoying her
Yes.
book. Yeah.
Wow. So there's something even beyond that seems like reachable, or at least
Or spiritually
aspirationally. Yeah.
reachable,
Yeah.
right.
I've got to ask you about the Vatican. That's like I've got to hear what that experience was like for you, and meeting these theologian are there theologians
Oh, yeah.
who are also space scientists or
And
astronomers?
physicists, yeah.
Yep.
Well, they're Jesuits. There are some folks who aren't Jesuits who are affiliated, who are members of other traditions or not members of orders, who are, ministers or priests who do community work. But so originally, there was an expectation of these astronomers being part of what every royal community would have. So you have the official royal astronomers of France, whatever. The Pope continued with this, and by the 20th century, things had started to shift, but the Vatican Observatory remained important. They moved from Rome to Castel Gandolfo, which is this area by kind of a huge volcanic lake, which is either called Lake Gandolfo or Lake Albano. It's kind of southish of Rome. And they had kind of an observatory put together there, but the light pollution there is still like now it's too high. So they're affiliated. They actually have two locations. They still have their Castel Gandolfo, which is right next to the Pope's summer palace. And then you also have the Tucson location where I just was last weekend. They have kind of an outpost in Tucson, Arizona. They're affiliated with the University of Arizona, and they have a dedicated telescope out in the mountains there. I think it's Mount Kit. And they will get data from that. I was just actually talking to the person who heads that area out there on Friday, so about a week ago. And in Castel Gandolfo, in the I want to say 90s, maybe early 2000s, they took over what used to be a convent, but it was a fairly modern building built after World War II in an area that had been bombed out. And so it reminds me a lot of a university building. Like it could be a physics department, except it's got all of this religious stuff. So it could be a physics department at a Catholic university. I think that's the vibe it has. Everybody's got an office on the first floor, just like you would expect professors to have. They have all kinds of objects. They have a meteorite lab, not meteor, meteorite lab, where they've got a huge collection of meteorites that have fallen in different places, and equipment for studying meteorites, including something called a pycnometer, which measures the density of meteorites using gas and different chambers that move gas around in different pressures and things like that. They've got moon rocks in there. Um, they have everybody's got an office and a computer and a desk, just like a faculty member. They have guest apartment. I was there kind of in the off season, so I was there by myself, but literally multiple bedrooms, bathrooms, living room, dining table, everything you would expect there. And I lived there by myself for those 4 weeks and then would come out into the rest of the building and go bother people in their offices. Like an annoying grad student, what are you working on? And can I help? And this kind of thing. I need to interview you. They have a library. The library's got a lot of amazing stuff that goes way back. And anytime the Pope gets something that's spacey, it ends up with them. So they have literal, like, first editions of Isaac Newton's work. And they've got stuff written by Kepler and, like these amazing astronomers who changed things like crazy. They're very proud of, I can't think of his first name right now, but Sekia, who was a priest, but also was one of the first people to figure out how to use, um, like understanding the colors that we can understand chemically from stars to understand their composition, chromatography. Um, they've got a lot of religious artwork. They have a flag of the Vatican, of Vatican City, the Holy See, that was taken to the moon and returned. They have an amazing model of the moon with all the landing sites labeled that was given to them by NASA personnel. They have autographed pictures from Catholic astronauts in various places. Um, they have a cappuccino room. So they meet at 10 o'clock every morning after they have a general meeting. At 10 o'clock, they go and there's one room where they will have cappuccinos. And there is a big cappuccino machine like you'd see anywhere else in like a cafe. And everybody stands around and drinks cappuccinos. And if you have a publication that's come out, you're required to bring pastries that day, as well as a printout of your publication, which then goes on the bulletin board. So I was there a couple times where the pastries came through because somebody had, something in a journal. And as I said, they get their funding. Like they don't have to apply for grants, so the funding's very steady. But they are expected to, publish. That was one of the jokes they told me for Jesuits. It's publish or perish, but perish like lead a parish. So you, which is scholar. Um, and I'm just going to be very myself for a second here. The amount of education they have is insane. Everybody's got like PhDs in physics, but then also philosophy, but then also a doctorate in divinity and multiple master's degrees. And one of the people I met over last weekend speaks 8 languages fluently and another 5 he's okay at.
Wow.
I'm just like, yeah. So, the sheer level of intelligence. And so I had to be on my game to do interviews with people who were talking about how time moved during the first moments of the Big Bang. And how do we understand time when time is part of space time, but the Big Bang is starting. And the Big Bang was George Lemaitre, who was a Catholic priest who came up with the concept. And then he did come up with the name, but he embraced the name later. And so a very strong sense that the work they're doing as astronomers is part of the tradition of the Catholic Church. And I've seen members of that group speak to Catholic audiences, and they really like to set themselves aside from more biblical literalist Protestants, and to the point of being a little mocking sometimes.
I was wondering about that and about the expectation for publication. Is it your sense that they're completely uncensored? Is there what if something that a discovery or an idea is counter to the church's position? Is it ha- what happens in that case?
They publish. I mean, they're not. They made it very clear that they're not interested in maintaining a particular position. In fact, the impression I got, and Pope Francis was Pope when I was there, and he was like the first and only Jesuit Pope. So the perspective among the Jesuits is science, science first, truth first. Let's see what's really going on. So there is not the idea that science is somehow going to be threatening. A lot of people have gotten upset, and there's variance within Catholicism, right? Just like anything else. But some people get upset with the fact that, yeah, the Pope Pope Leo, ardent supporter of the idea of evolution, right? So they're not biblical literalists, even though there are Catholic biblical literalists. I just lost that word there for a second. So there's, people within the Catholic Church who are very, have a more Protestant leaning perspective on, 6 days of creation being literal or something like that. But that's not the official Vatican position. And so the work they're doing, they're very proud of representing the compatibility of the modern church and science. And they will correct anybody who thinks that Galileo was burnt at the stake or something. They'll talk about, the way that the church adjusted to scientific ideas. It reminds me a little bit of something the Dalai Lama once said, which somebody said, well, what if science proved that reincarnation was impossible? And his comment was, well, then the religion would have to change to accommodate that new knowledge. And I feel like I'm not being like a giant Catholic apologist, but as somebody who spent time there and has interviewed many of the people who are Vatican astronomers, um, it's very much a science first, not science only, but the truth of science is not going to contradict the truth of, from their perspective, the universe that God made and the earth that God made and the way things work. You can only learn more about God by studying space, by studying the universe, by studying um, galactic lensing or gravitational lensing so that you can see around galaxies. And the stuff they do is it's just focus on black holes. Like one of them is just so focused on black holes and how light and gravity are bent by black holes. And they're really at this very esoteric intellectual level that works with their approach to religion in fascinating ways.
Are there any examples of doctrine or positions that have changed, let's just say the last 100 years, because of the work the astronomers are doing?
I don't think that doctrine necessarily changes based on what they find. I think there's just an acceptance. I don't think the Catholic doctrine in general has ever espoused, if it hasn't recently espoused sort of literal understandings of biblical descriptions. So most people I've been there and don't think like the world was created in 6 days, for instance. Um, I think, though, that there's an expectation that science is illuminating and not threatening. But I can't give you something off the top of my head. I know that the acceptance of Darwinian theory is something that's mainstream, and something that popes in general accept. But that's more than 100 years ago. So that's the
Yes.
main one I can think of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. It's always been interesting to me to hear positions that feel threatened by discovery in science and questioning. It seems that the position itself is rather fragile, or the entity is rather fragile if it can collapse under questions.
Yeah, I mean, in contrast, the Ark encounter, astronaut encounter thing I went to, that was really interesting because the men who spoke that day were kind of united in their belief that the world is in the universe is 6,000 years old. Ken Ham in particular was talking about how the universe was created not for any specific purpose other than to impress us here on Earth. So you have all of these galaxies and all of these nebulas and he was naming them, and then he said, those are there to show us what God is capable of. And that perspective is very different where instead of them being places, everybody there is part of their Q&A agreed that humans will never get to Mars, for instance, isn't even necessarily a mainstream view. So, once again, you've got this blending of religion and space exploration, or, I consider astronomy to be a type of space
Mhm.
exploration. And I was fascinated by the number of how theologians and astronauts and science fiction writers and engineers and medical doctors and space medicine all interact with each other. It's not like people are siloed. The community interacts with each other. I went to something called Space Fest in 2019, and it was fascinating to watch different people in different areas of space research geeking out about other people. Like, oh my gosh, you're an astronaut. Oh, but oh my gosh, you're my favorite science fiction writer. But oh my gosh, the work you do in physics is incredible. And it was this weird kind of enjoyable hyper fanning going on. And I think that seeing how integrated it all is kind of is why you end up with these little subgroups where you have one group that might be very pro science and another one like Jeffrey and Williams gave this talk with very wordy slides where he's very specifically talked about how the Enlightenment and Darwin and people who led up to Darwin and followed him, that was a satanic influence on science. And that the Dark Ages were probably not really the Dark Ages. That was back when science really was, the main arbiter of what's true or not from their perspective was, is it in the Bible? And if it's not in the Bible, then you have to throw it out. And that observational science, like I'm in orbit, I can see that I'm surrounding a sphere, I'm orbiting a sphere,
Mhm.
is very different from theoretical science, which argues that the universe is 14 billion years old. So they would accept observational science, but they wouldn't accept theoretical science, which is tainted by Satanism. So very, very different takes on same experiences of understanding what space is, but understanding it through a particular religious lens, which I find fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it's fascinating that there is a level of civility within the community that supports all of these different uh, perspectives that I don't know I've heard about any other community where this would exist.
Yeah, I mean, part of it's because it's a work community, right? So you could argue that there are different viewpoints in the military or that there are different viewpoints among electricians or plumbers. But I think there's something heightened about it being space. And to like quote Clifford Geertz, there's something about space being the really real. Like we know where we are, but what's really out there, what's beyond this. And I think the overlap in science and religion is trying to explain, what's beyond what we can see, what's up there, what's out there, what is this for, where did this come from?
Mhm,
All of these big cosmological questions, and you can answer them in either way, but oftentimes the language overlaps. Um, but the way people see it is different. Another anthropologist who does space stuff is Jack Traphagen, who's now retired, and he has worked quite a bit with Japanese and JAXA and the Japanese Space Agency. And he says that a lot of the Christian perspective is completely absent in what you would see in the Japanese Space Agency, where Buddhism and Shinto would have more influence, and there's less of an idea that we're going to go out and conquer space and be boots down on different planets and explore new worlds. And more of a, how will this benefit the community and what can we do to make life better on Earth by going into space? And it's just formed by a different religious
mhm,
perspective. And I think there are some people in space community, especially space fans, who really don't like the idea that there would be any religious component to space exploration. I've had people tell me when I've written articles for the space community, like for space fans, like in
mhm,
review, that I'm projecting because I must be very religious. And so I'm seeing something that's not there. Well, obviously it's there. I mean, there's so much data and influence. I mean, one of the things I did for the space review was write just a field report from the astronaut encounter at the Ark encounter. And I didn't make any of it up. I had pictures. So that kind of thing. I think it's important for people to know that humans are humans are humans. And when we go out into space, we're going to continue being humans. So if religious experience and pilgrimage and the idea of sacred sites is something we have here on Earth, it's not going to go away.
mhm.
It's going to be integrated into what it means to be a spacefaring species. Um, but it's complex and it doesn't all work in one direction. And just in the American space program, I've seen so much variation. So,
Yeah, I like what you're saying about humans are humans are humans because we are. And when we were on land, we were being humans, and when we were seafaring, we're humans. And I like how you say spacefaring. That's an interesting new term that I think I'll be adopting. Um, I want to talk before we end this. I really want to hear about your new book, which is called The Overview Effect.
no, the Ultraview Effect.
Ultraview. Sorry, I wrote this down
It's
wrong.
it's a
Sorry about
play
that.
on overview.
The Ultraview Effect, which is going to be published in May?
May, University of California Press. So I, after talking to Zach, I got very interested in this idea of looking out into space because I was already interested in the overview effect, which was Frank White's term
Yes.
for that feeling of looking at the Earth and kind of understanding it better, but also being in awe of it, this giant object. I've talked about Timothy Morton's ideas of hyperobjects and some of the writing I've done on this, and how disturbing it is to see something that you kind of only thought about mentally made real in front of you. But and I've talked to a lot of astronauts about looking at the Earth from space, and for most, not all, it is a very powerful experience. In fact, there's a channel that's really good on YouTube called Down to Earth, which is by NASA, and I think Frank White works with them, and it's astronaut like clips about what they felt like when they looked at the Earth from outer space. But when I talked to Zach and I talked to Theo, I talked to someone else named Charles who had a similar experience looking out into space from space. You don't have the atmosphere. You don't have the idea that you're somehow protected on your planet. Instead, it's there. One of the astronauts I interviewed more recently, I call him Ben, he talked about like looking out into nothingness, which is kind of an interesting corollary. But I was trying to think, okay, if we have the overview effect, this is similar. This is an overwhelming feeling of looking at the reality of something that's disturbing. But unlike the overview effect, it doesn't the overview effect, people go, oh, I get it now. That's the Earth. It's life. It's got, this thin atmosphere. And the ultraview effect, it doesn't make you go, oh, I get it. Instead of looking out into space, it's more like, I don't understand what I'm seeing. And this incredibly inability to get and process what you can see among the people who had it. In some cases where it requires like psychology of awe, I think about like Joan Verputten. I cite them a lot. This idea of being shaken by large objects and then needing accommodation, like needing a reason, like, what is this? I need an answer. I need an answer. I need an answer. But I noticed that in my interviews with astronauts who'd seen this physically in person, but also people who work in space, especially those who send probes out or astronomers or think about what space does to the human body, there's this incredible intellectual humility that comes from their sense of awe. So space is huge and we do not understand what's going on. One quote I sometimes use from Zach, it's a little, sometimes these astronauts use language, but he said, we don't know crap about anything. We really don't. That's what he realized looking out into the stars. And so that we don't know crap about anything feeling, um, that's, that's humility that comes from awe. That's, I've seen something, I don't get it. I realize I don't know anything. And that feeling of humility is something I've seen in people who work on computer code for rovers on Mars, people who send probes out to photograph distant planets and beyond, people who do work in amazing ways. And this is not to say that everybody who does space work has humility, right? I can think of many counterexamples. I'm sure you can think of many counterexamples of people who've gone up into space or have space companies or stuff that don't seem to have a humble bone in their body. But for the people who do the real work, that realization that that they're working in a context that is so full of unknown information, and even the idea that it's not possible for us to understand some of what we're looking at. How do you understand 14 billion years? How do you understand billions and billions and billions of planets? I mean, how do you see billions of planets and have your mind do anything with that? So that shrinking feeling, that humility comes next. But another thing that happened is that I've noticed that people in this community don't just say, "Oh, we don't understand, we'll never understand." Instead, it's like it creates a vacuum. So I know very little, and then my mind is sort of empty. I actually talk about beginner's mind from Buddhism, where you like start everything with the understanding that you don't know what's going on. And that allows for an approach to exploration that's not manifest destiny, that's not conquering the world, that instead is more, let's figure out what's going on and let me reach out to other people who might know more than I do. So throughout the book, I've got three parts. One is awe, one is humility, and one is exploring the unknown. But I talk about how that pattern, how I see it in people involved in space exploration and physics and astronomy and engineering and space medicine and astronauts who have the experience of physically being somewhere where they can see stuff, and how that has led in many of them to an approach to exploration that emphasizes cooperation, that emphasizes admitting that you don't know what you're doing or we don't know what we're doing and we need more information before we act, that is cautious and respectful. And I argue that this is a really good mental place to be in. This is a trade book, so it's an academic trade book. I definitely had to write differently. So there was a lot of stop scaffolding. This isn't, we don't want your methodology in this. I'm like, okay. So writing for more of a general audience. And so the book is really aimed at people who are non-specialists, but it's also very multidisciplinary. So I've got anthropology in there, I've got psychology, I've got astronomy and physics and medicine and a lot of evolutionary biology. And trying to kind of show this pattern and how what I'm seeing in the space community can actually be reflected. And this is like the most tradey part of it. I've got the end of it is talking about how people who are readers who can like go out and try to experience awe or try to cultivate humility or try to open themselves up to being curious and learning about things in a particular way. So I've got kind of an end section
Yeah,
that's
how
beautiful.
to sort of
Yeah,
so what is one example of what a person could do to experience this sounds like disorientation?
right.
Eh, eh,
I'm going to give you one I actually had to cut out because they had a limited number of pages. And I had to choose certain ones I was going to keep and certain ones I was going to cut. But one that I like to do just myself is to think about something that's incredibly high or incredibly deep, like the Mariana Trench or, the distance to the top of, Mount Denali, for
mhm.
instance. And that is if you have a car to make a drive while keeping an eye on your counter and track how far it is to get to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. You're going to be driving for such a long time, but imagine that distance down or imagine that distance up. Some of it is just about, in some of the examples I give, though, are just about being more open to trying things or taking different routes or eating food that's unfamiliar, kind of basic things, but things that sometimes people don't think about as an approach to exploration. Part of it too is I don't know if I mentioned this or this came up, but I'm in the Explorers Club. I had one of my astronauts willing to write me a letter of recommendation to get into the Explorers Club. And so I got in 2020 and I thought, well, if I'm going to have an Apollo astronaut write me a letter, I'm going to go for it. And I got in and I'm a fellow in the Explorers Club. But since 2022, I've been the chair of the Chicago Great Lakes chapter. And I would not have expected this, but it's been really fun. And I spend a lot of time talking to other folks in the community who do underwater cave exploration and um, dirigibles and creating approaches to saving endangered species that are new and amazing and medicine in high mountain low oxygen kinds of things. And folks who practice traditional wayfinding in indigenous communities. And that idea of exploration really kind of opened up to me because there's so many chances to talk to people at events who do amazing, amazing, amazing things.
Mhm.
And I think that all of the things are connected. And I think that awe is really the starting point for so many people. But I've noticed that a lot of folks don't like that feeling of awe. And I'm not going to pick on any family members in particular, but I've had family members who it's too uncomfortable to feel awe. They want to think of the sky as kind of a backdrop that they can ignore. And yeah, the sun moves across and we have different weather, but they never think about that we're on a planet that's orbiting a star that's one of 8 or 9 or however many you wanna say, um, including dwarf planets, that's in a solar system that is orbiting around the center of a galaxy, which is itself in orbit. Like, we don't think of those things, and it's uncomfortable sometimes to think of those things, and I really want people to be uncomfortable. Very
Yes. Yeah.
straightforward
Yeah.
thing. So I'm encouraging that. Get uncomfortable. It's like when I send my students out to unfamiliar religious services. Yeah, it's going to be awkward. Do it. Get out there. Have that awkwardness, have that openness, do something that you're uncomfortable with. And so it's ethnographic work, but it has a little bit of that element
Mhm.
in it as
Yeah.
well.
I'm really looking forward to reading it. I've been a long admirer of your work
Thank you.
and also of your perseverance. It was really impactful for me to hear about that you had this interest, this space interest early on, and you put it aside. And I think many people do because of work requirements or promotion requirements and the expectations, at least in an academic context. And then you return to it and look at the wide impact. I mean, you're a pioneer in this area, and you're also a pioneer for other people who have interesting, innovative, out of the box ideas who may think that they have to give them up in order to pursue a particular career. And so, thank you for your perseverance and for being an example of someone who continued to come back to what inspires you.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say. It helps to be kind of enmeshed in it in my own home life, right?
Mhm.
If you saw what we have in the garage in terms of space memorabilia, I'm surrounded by it. But um it definitely was kind of an unorthodox thing to be studying, and I tried to sort of keep it on the side a little bit until I was able to bring it fully in and no longer have to um keep a file for, my next promotion. So it's a privileged place to be in. And I realize not everybody has that. But I do think a very long time ago when I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go into graduate school in the first place and trying to talk myself out of it for not being practical, I met, this is going to sound weird, but I met a random French person who was a reporter covering the America's Cup in San Diego and had to take a break from my job. I was working at Starbucks as a barista, and my boss made me take my full break. And so I just had a conversation with him. And I was like, I'm trying to decide if I want to go to grad school. He says, do you feel passionate about it? I said, yes, I do. He goes, then you should do it because if you're passionate about something, you will put the time in that's necessary to become good at it. And if you're not passionate about something, you're never going to get really good at it. As long as you get good at the thing that you love, you're going to have an impact. And that really made an impression on me. It's crazy. It was a random conversation, but it made me feel, oh my gosh, he's right. Time spent doing something is important, and we don't want to do things we don't enjoy.
Mhm.
So it's a privilege. It's lucky. Not everybody has the financial ability to do everything, but I think that even if it's not your main thing, the thing that you're passionate about needs to stay at least on the sidelines, and maybe you can work it into something else.
Yeah, I totally agree. Uh, I'll put the link to the Ultraview Effect up
Thank you.
at the end of the episode. Looking forward to reading it. And thank you again for taking time on this very, very cold day and snowy and
Blistering here
weird
right now.
uh, thankfully, our internet stayed stable on both ends. I really appreciate being able to talk to you and hear about your journey from being a child at Space Mountain all the way to now writing and publishing the Ultraview Effect and all of your experiences in between.
Thank you for inviting me, Heather. This has been really fun. And I appreciate the work you do with this podcast and all the work you do on pilgrimage. It's really important.
Thank you.